It looks like the Leafs and Samsonov have a little bit of work to do before their arbitration hearing. Also, we have a little bit of an update on the Matthews and Nylander contract negotiations, and another assistant general manager joins the Leafs front office. This is the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Leafs podcast, your daily fix for all things Leafs. I'm your host, David Morassutti from Sportsnet. Mike DeStefano away on vacation, still enjoying the beautiful, I think he's on a beach right now in Italy. What a guy. But he's enjoying himself, and we still got some Leafs talk. We are a daily Maple Leaf Centric podcast, and as I said on the last episode, we are down to 3 episodes a week now as we are in the full off-season swing, but we do have some Leafs talk today. Just remember, guys, that today's episode is also brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $200 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, the official sportsbook of MLB. So as I said, we do have some news, a little bit of news involving Elliotte Samsonov. We know that the Leafs are a few days away. As I'm recording this is July 19th, so a lot could change between now and the potential hearing on Friday with the Leafs and Ilya Samsonov. And when these sort of things happen, we're seeing a lot of teams settle these arbitration cases well before the hearing. We've been seeing smaller deals, 1-2 year deals. Most of them have been 2-year deals. So if the Leafs and Samsonov are able to come to an agreement before arbitration, it's likely going to be in that 1 to 2 year range. But right now, Elliotte Friedman's latest update was that the arbitration filing for Samsonov, the player is looking for $4.9 million in arbitration. The Leafs are looking for $2.4 million. So that's a $2.5 million gap between the Leafs and Samsonov. And I'm sure a lot of people, the Discord chat has been popping off with that news. A lot of people are wondering, that's quite a bit of a gap between Samsonov and the team. $2.5 million. It's not like it's like they're 1 million or 1.5. 2.5 is not, it's not enough. It's nothing. It's not like it's, a huge gap, but it's also not, nothing. Let's just say that. In a lot of these cases, it's a good thing that we get the sort of range that Samsonov is looking for and what the team is looking for, because a lot of times in arbitration, and I'm sure a lot of people have already said this, both sides usually meet in the middle, right? So in this case, if you're looking at the 2.4 and 4.9, you take that, you divide it in half, basically, of what it's would equal to. That's about $3.65 million. Now, some have asked me, let's say this goes to arbitration and the arbiter gives, let's say they give that number, or maybe closer to that 3.75 or whatever, even $4 million. The Leafs then, because Samsonov was the one that elected for arbitration, the Leafs would then have the decision of whether they want to make that a 1 year or 2 year deal. I feel like this, and Elliotte Friedman reported this on the NHL Network, saying that this is likely going to be a short-term deal. The Leafs aren't going to commit long-term to Samsonov, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Yes, he's 26 years old, so he's not, he's still relatively young, but this is somebody who's just getting himself back up as a starter, right? Like last year was a rebound year for him. Yeah, signs that 1 year, $1.8 million contract, and he had a 27-10-5 record, 919 save percentage. So respectable numbers considering what the Leafs goaltending has been like the last few years. And he established himself as a starting goaltender, but still in a tandem. Let's not forget that 42 games, right? That's starters that's a starter's workload, but he's not in that upper echelon of like the 50-60 games that some of these top end goaltenders are playing right now. So when we're looking at Samsonov's arbitration case right now, yeah, he might go in and say, I'm the team's number one. And that's a good thing for his side. But the Leafs can also say, look, he was in a tandem last year. We can still potentially see the workload as more of a tandem rather than him playing 60 games, right? So these are sort of things that will be talked about in arbitration. He made 1.8 last year, and I thought that a new deal for him, obviously he played above a $1.8 million level. You take that number from last year and you double it, and that's obviously $3.6 million. That's where I think this is probably going to end up being. If I had to give my prediction now, between the time I record this and the time it gets out, we might already have news on what's happening with Samsonov's deal. So something to be keeping an eye on. I know the Leafs will have many decisions to make about what happens when the Samsonov deal comes about, because they're going to have to make cap space to get this done. Now, because there is an arbitration hearing, the Leafs would then have and we've talked about this on the podcast, that there will be a second buyout window opened up after, depending on what happens with the arbitration case with Samsonov. So obviously a lot of that will look into whether the Leafs decide to buy out Matt Murray. And we've talked about this many times before of, okay, if the Leafs do decide to buy out Matt Murray, it makes sense for this year because the Leafs cap hit won't cost that much, right? A buyout right now would actually essentially the Leafs would cost $687,500 in a cap hit, but then it's a $2 million charge the year after that. This is why I think they're still weighing the buyout option, because that $2 million charge, that's 1 to 2 players depending on what the Leafs do. That's also $2 million less you're going to have in room for these new contracts you're going to sign for Matthews and potentially Nylander. Now, funny enough, Locked On Senators has been a big proponent on the Leafs doing the buyout of Matt Murray, because obviously right now Matt Murray has had some of his salary retained by the Senators, of roughly in about the $2 million range, just around that. So basically the Senators would be charged 229. Like, basically the Senators would save. It would make sense for the Senators to want the Leafs to buy out Matt Murray. Now, thing is, if the Leafs don't want to take that $2 million hit next year, the only other option you're going to have is to trade him to another team and add something on top of that. And I kind of discussed there are a couple of teams that could do it, Chicago being obviously the big one. Obviously, if the Leafs trade Murray to Chicago, it's for him to play, and he can't get bought out after the fact. Now, Elliotte Friedman also brought up another good note about buying out Matt Murray. You cannot buy out a player if he's not healthy, right? So the first thing the Leafs would have to determine is if it's even possible to buy out Matt Murray. So we know that he ended the season as the backup goaltender. Whether or not he was just healthy enough to be a backup or healthy enough to start, that's something they're going to have to keep an eye on. Did Matt Murray go and have any, we've seen teams, I don't know if you remember the Jared Cowan situation when the Leafs bought him out to save money. And there was a whole thing about him not being healthy, reportedly, when that buyout happened, and they were trying to fight it. Because obviously, when you get bought out, you don't get you're essentially, the player loses out on money, right? They make one, but the buyout obviously helps the team save money over the next few years. Murray is owed $8 million in salary, but if he gets bought out, that's obviously less money that he loses money in the end. So the injury part is going to be something to keep an eye on here when it comes to the Leafs and Matt Murray. I do think the buyout, it's looking a little, unless it can find a team that's willing to take that contract, that could likely be the option there for the Leafs. All right, we're going to discuss a little bit more about contract stuff, because that's main conversation here in Toronto. We have Matthews and Nylander. We're still kind of hearing crickets on what's going on with those ones. We do have a little update on what's going on with them, so I'm going to discuss that on the other side. This is the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Leafs is brought to you by one of our top sponsors, and that is the FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to over under. Who you think is going to hit the first home run? You can go right now. FanDuel has a bunch of NHL player props, season props, whatever you're looking for the NHL season. FanDuel's already bringing that out, and you can do it all on the app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball and the Locked On Podcast Network. Welcome back into the Locked On Leafs podcast. It is your team every day. We are now down to 3 shows a week. Just a reminder for those who are listening to the show and have come, those who have been here every day know that we go to 3 days a week in the summer, because doing 5 shows a week during the summer, it's a little bit tougher when there's not a lot of news. The Samsonov news, we're still waiting for that to drop. We'll have an episode on what happens after that situation's clear out. Usually what happens, I forgot to mention that, if the team goes to arbitration, within 48 hours, the arbitrator then sends out the ruling. So 48 hours, in that 48-hour period, that's when it all has to get settled. And I believe once that's been done, then the team has 48 hours to make a decision. I've followed quite a few arbitration cases in my career. Very rarely do we see arbitration hearings get to the final stages. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on with Samsonov. I'm sure the club will do its best to ensure this is a smooth process, because I don't think the Leafs are looking to move on from Samsonov at this point. Now, this obviously will have a ripple effect, especially if it's a 2-year deal, on what happens with the Leafs salary cap, not only going into this season, but next season and after that, where the cap, yes, will jump up a little bit, but we know that there's big money set to come in for someone like Auston Matthews and William Nylander. So we've heard many reports that, Nylander's in that $10 million range potentially to get a deal. Elliotte Friedman actually came when he was on talking about Samsonov. He also said that the Leafs and Nylander, it feels like it's at a standstill. Basically meaning, we know that there's been that side of like the Leafs aren't willing to go plus, over $10 million per year on a contract. And that's what Nylander's looking at. He feels like, that is something he wants to get done. Now, Elliotte Friedman also reports that Matthews and the Leafs, it's going to get done. He is almost convinced it's going to get done. But he is looking, big thing for him is term. And we know everyone's talking about the Leafs trying to get Matthews done for 8 years. It doesn't feel like that's going to happen, because the salary cap hasn't made that increase that we know is coming. So right now, it looks like Matthews is going to sign between 3 and 5 years. That's what we're hearing. I would like for it to be the maximum 5 years. The number here is going to be interesting because, again, we keep hearing of like over 13. I'm sorry. If the Leafs are not getting 8 years from Auston Matthews, he can't be maxing out on salary at this point. Sure, he can get paid more than obviously what he's getting paid now in that 11.34 range. Is he worth more than McKinnon? I think you can make that argument. 12 points. I think he's at 12.6. But I don't think that this is going to get to a point where he's getting like 5 years, $13.5 million. I can't see the Leafs doing that, especially if they're not going to get 8 years out of it. And I know, look, Auston Matthews has a right to not sign for 8 years. That's his right. And when you look at basically looking to get more money when the salary cap goes up, it makes a lot of sense for him to do that. I'm sure that's probably the stickler with Nylander too, because he probably feels, well, if I'm signing now for 8 years, I want to make sure I'm going to maximize on what I can make, because the salary cap is going to go up. And that always means that the cap always goes up for the star players. yeah, there are some guys, some players that do see a bump in their pay because the minimum salary always goes up in those cases when the salary cap goes up. But it's always the top end guys that max out more on their salary. And we had that discussion if you listen to the last episode about, you know, doing the whole balance between helping the team and make sure you earn your money. This is the tricky part. So with Matthews, if he were to sign for 5 years, that would take him into that early 30s, and then he can get probably one last big deal, right? I think right now, if you're the Leafs, you're trying to get that five. You're trying to maximize your term a little bit more, so you have a better idea of your long-term plan. To do this again after in 3 more years, not the most ideal situation, but I think the positive thing here is that it's going to likely get done between Matthews and the Leafs. Nylander not looking as not looking as great when it comes to getting a deal done. It just maybe they're waiting for the Matthews one to settle off, so then they have a better idea of what they can pay Nylander. That's only really Brad Treliving knows at this point what they're trying to do with all that. But the important thing here is the Leafs are trying to get these deals done, and and hopefully they get done soon, so we don't have to spend too much time wondering and debating about what these deals. I want to actually talk about what these deals are, what it means for this team going into that season when those deals eventually kick in. Let's not forget that those two players are signed next season, so it's not like there's like a time clock to get these deals done before these guys hit free agency. They still have technically the whole season. Yes, you don't want to have to deal with this during the season. The Bruins did that with Pastrnak, and it seemed to work out for the Bruins because they got him signed to that deal and the long-term deal. So the Leafs could do that. With Nylander, I'm not as convinced you can go into the season without a deal getting done, just because it feels like there's not this cohesiveness of what both the team and what him are trying to get done here. So obviously, Matthews, you like to get them both done before the season. I'm more convinced that Matthews can get done, even if it's not done before the season. But feels like they've had quite a bit of time to at least try to get this sorted out. So we'll see if the Leafs are able to get it done. Now, on the other side, I do want to talk about another assistant general manager joining the Leafs. They made that hire this week. So a little more news. Brad Treliving kind of filling out his front office a little bit more. So we'll discuss that on this other side. This is the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast, your team every day. David Morassutti here with Mike DeStefano on vacation. Again, remember, this is a 3-day-a-week podcast now as we go into the summertime. Not a lot of news coming out. Really, like any news at this point can get talked about. We try to bring up great discussions on the show, but the Leafs did make some news. It wasn't the news I was expecting to hear because the Leafs don't have that assistant general manager to replace Spencer Carberry, who left to go and join the Washington Capitals. I thought when I saw a Leafs PR notification of news that this was going to be the replacement for Spencer Carberry, because I saw Maple Leafs hire assistant general manager. Derek Clancey joined the team as the assistant general manager of player personnel. We know the running joke right now is that the Leafs have a lot of assistant general managers. I'm going to count it right now, actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 assistant general managers right now. Maybe this is where they also have directors, like a bunch of directors too. I've been trying to figure out how many assistant general managers is enough for a team. I mean, for the Leafs, it doesn't really matter how, like, there's no cap on how much you can spend on your front office. So do we really care? So he is the assistant general manager of player personnel. So a little bit on Derek Clancey for those who don't know who he is. 54 years old, was the assistant GM with the Vancouver Canucks last year. He was a pro scout with the Flames when Treliving was there from the 2021-2022 season. This after he spent 14 seasons with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Obviously, he was a pro scout there when they won their 3 Stanley Cups. He was the director of pro scouting for 9 seasons and director of player personnel for 2 seasons. And basically, Brad Treliving and his statement said, I feel Derek is one of the premier talent evaluators in our game. He's a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, play a big role as we continue to build our goal of building a championship team. And so when you look at, and Jim Rutherford actually brought Derek Clancey over to the Canucks because he was also the member of the general manager there. So from people, I saw Rachel Dory tweet out that, Clancy's a good blend of the old school, new school. I did hear some of the jokes. Well, when you go out and you get to draft Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, you're going to obviously do well. But here's the thing, as we've seen in Toronto, it's not the top end guys that's really the tough part for the management team. It's surrounding the top end players with the right cast to go out and win a Stanley Cup. Remember when Pittsburgh eventually won that cup, how much of a grind it was when they won that cup, and then they hadn't won for a while. They kind of reinvented themselves a little bit, and bada boom, they won 2 cups in a row. And obviously Clancy played a role in that. So I'm excited about the hire. I'm excited about what he can bring in terms of, in that role of player personnel. Is he going to bring in a different vision maybe than what we've seen from players from other front office guys in the past? So just to note, he is pretty much in charge of player personnel, or he is working in tandem with Brad Treliving on player personnel decisions. If you want to know the other assistant general manager, you have obviously Dr. Haley Wickenheiser, who's doing player development. She's been pretty much she ran the development camp. I'm going to assume she's going to be playing a big part in their upcoming rookie tournament, which we're still waiting to hear the full details on, but I assume that's going to be coming out soon. You have Ryan Hardy, who is pretty much in charge of the minor league operation with the Toronto Marlies. Daryl Metcalf, as we know, he does the analytics, so hockey research and development. And then obviously Shane Doan was brought in to be a special advisor to general manager Brad Treliving. And yeah, so a lot of assistant general managers, but they all have specific areas that they're working with, right? It's not like Brandon Pridham, I would say, is a second-hand man to Brad Treliving because he is assistant general manager. He handles contracts, day-to-day stuff with the salary cap. He is probably the most important assistant general manager out of all the ones on the Leafs because of what he does. And we always hear about Brandon Pridham all the time. So it's good that the Leafs are obviously able to bring in somebody with Derek Clancey's resume. What that means for Dave Morrison, who is the director of player personnel, I'm not entirely sure. He is still listed on the Leafs site, but look, the other thing too you have to keep in mind is Kyle Dubas could poach some of these guys from the front office to come and join in Pittsburgh. That's still a possibility. I don't think the Canucks expected Derek Clancey to leave to go enjoy the Leafs. So something to keep an eye on there. I mean, if you look at the Leafs team management page, it is like a lengthy list. Like those meetings, there must be like a multiple meetings. So you cannot get all these people in a boardroom together. But obviously some news to keep us basically focused on the Leafs during this period. We'll see what Clancy's main role will be in terms of what his vision will be like going forward with the Leafs, and how much of that influence from the Pittsburgh days he can bring and offer advice to Brad Treliving in this sort of situation right now for Toronto, a team that's just hasn't been able to reach that next step as a contender. Many great hockey minds you can get in there, the better. Obviously, we still have many decisions to have to get done this offseason. I still think there's more moves to come down. Maybe they're just waiting for the Samsonov shoe to drop so then they can figure out all the rest of them, because I feel like it's going to be like one after the other, after the other, after the other. And it could be a busy week. We'll see. And we'll keep you all up to date here on the Locked On Leafs podcast as much as possible. I'd like to thank you all for coming and supporting the show. Continue to support the show and make sure you tell all your friends to come and subscribe to the Locked On Leafs podcast. We're going to be doing this all summer long. We're not taking a break like some other podcasts do, where they say, maybe we'll do one a week or one every other week. Nope, we're here all throughout the summer. Mike will be back soon. He'll be recharged, maybe gained a few pounds. I mean, when you go to Italy, it's a little hard. He's in like bakeries and meat shops every day. I gotta stop following this guy on Instagram. It's getting a little tough for me. But we'll be keeping you up to date on all of those things. And I now had some people reach out to me to look and come on for a Fan Friday episode. So I'm going to work on, if you sent me a message, I've got your message. I'm working through them. I got to go through a little bit of a process to figure out how many people I can bring on the show, how I want to do it. If you want to stay on for a full episode, good on you. We might have to break it up into segments. We'll figure that out. I have basically right now, I worked on a survey to make sure I'm bringing on people who are fans of the show and not just looking to get a free spot here on our platform, right? So, going to do this properly, and we'll definitely want to have as many of you on as we can throughout the summertime. This is the time where you get to we'll have a little bit of fun here on the show, right? Because when the season comes, it's business, it's serious stuff. We got to talk about things going on each and every day. Summertime, we can relax and open things up a little bit and have a little more fun. But until then, keep it locked right here on Locked On Leafs.